Russia preparing to formally and illegally annex up to 15% of Ukrainian territory. It's one of the biggest attempted land grabs in Europe since the Second World War. The United Nations chief says it will have no legal standing, but would be a dangerous escalation of the war. US President Joe Biden has joined other world leaders in rejecting Moscow's attempt to redraw international borders.
The United States, I want to be very clear about this, the United States will never recognize Russia's claims on Ukraine's sovereign territory. This so-called referenda was a sham, an absolute sham. The results were manufactured in Moscow. The true will of the Ukrainian people is evident every day as they sacrifice their lives to save their people and maintain the independence of their country.
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin is set to sign the accession documents at the Kremlin later today. He will then hold what is being billed as a victory speech, and Russian authorities plan to stage a celebratory concert on Red Square outside the Kremlin.
At Moscow's Red Square, preparations are underway. This banner says, "Together forever," with the names of the regions Russia plans to absorb. Here, Russian President Vladimir Putin plans to officially announce the annexation of the 4 Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. They make up about 15% of Ukraine's territory.
The people have made a conscious and free choice. They stated firmly to the whole world their wish to be with Russia, to forever tie their fate to our country, which was, is, and will be their historic motherland.
In the city of Kramatorsk in the Donetsk region, residents say they will defy Russian annexation.
Even if they come, our boys won't let us down. If necessary, we will fight too.
Please, don't do stupid things. Do not take the steps you intend to take in confirming and accepting the annexation of our territories. The Donbass has always been Ukraine, is Ukraine, and will always be Ukraine. We will fight for it.
Up to 4 million people were asked to vote in the 4 war-torn regions. Russia claimed an overwhelming victory, while Ukraine and its international partners dismissed the referendums as shams and a violation of international law.
It cannot be reconciled with the international legal framework. It stands against everything the international community is meant to stand for. It flouts the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It is a dangerous escalation. It has no place in the modern world. It must not be accepted.
The Kremlin seems unmoved by the criticism, but its actions are closing all doors to a diplomatic solution.
DW correspondent Nick Connolly joins us now from Kyiv. Does this formal annexation create a justification for Putin to use nuclear weapons in this war?
Well, that's definitely the line coming out of Moscow. We've had lots of warnings, some more open, some more veiled. Former President Dmitry Medvedev saying that once these territories became part of Russia's core territory, as he sees it, then Russia, yes, will be willing to use nuclear weapons. He spelled it out as directly as that. Obviously, not even Russia's closest allies are going to recognize this. We've heard from Serbia, Kazakhstan, indirectly from Belarus that this is not going to happen. But still, Russia seems to be satisfied that this justification is enough for it to make these threats. Whether or not this is more than bluff, we don't know. We've heard from US intelligence in recent days saying they haven't seen any activity around Russia's nuclear kind of facilities, any sense that those weapons are being brought out. And certainly here in Ukraine, it's being seen as a bluff, as an attempt to browbeat the West into concessions. But we're definitely hearing lots of voices, especially in Western Europe, who are very nervous about this and who are calling on people to take this very seriously indeed.
What about the recent territorial gains in Ukraine on the battlefield? What's the latest there?
Well, that's the thing. So right now, on the day where we're expecting to see Russia and Vladimir Putin sign the annexation of Donetsk region, in that same Donetsk region, there is a lot of fighting going on, and it's going in Ukraine's favor. There seems to be now a situation near the city of Liman, in the northwestern part of the Donbass region, where Ukrainian forces have taken a large number of Russian, their Russian opponents. Basically, they're surrounded from three sides and look set to be totally trapped in the next couple of hours if things go as expected. Sense there that the Ukrainians could take a huge number of Russian forces prisoner. They could also get a lot more in the way of Russian tech. There are even jokes here in Kiev now that Russia has become the biggest supplier of weapons to Ukraine because, in the last few weeks after their chaotic departure from the Kharkiv region, they just left tens, dozens and sometimes hundreds of pieces of different kinds of equipment behind them, often untouched with their factory manuals still there. So there's a sense that Ukraine is really taking advantage of its successes, of its kind of recent run of good fortune on the battlefield, while the Russians are trying to bring in people, mobilize new troops, which are so far untrained and not getting to the battlefields in sufficient numbers. So a real sense here that Ukraine is not going to wait, is not going to be interpreted, is not going to be put off rather by these annexations, and is going to try and ram home its advantage before the winter and before the kind of fighting dies down.
And Nick, is there anything else Kyiv will do about these annexations?
Well, we've heard from various figures here in Ukraine calling this a freak show, a propaganda show. Weirdly enough, in the recent days, it hasn't been the top story in news here. I think that has two reasons. On the one hand, people here had factored it in, they'd priced it in. There'd been talk about these annexations all across the summer, and then they kept on being put off. But people knew this was coming, and also they don't really want to give it that kind of place. They don't want to kind of dignify it with that much of a response. Obviously, we've had President Zelensky saying that this means the end of diplomacy, that there is no return to talks while Russia is planning this kind of thing, and if it indeed does do this, so that any kind of solution to this conflict will only be on the battlefield. But most of all, if you talk to Ukrainians, you look at what people are talking about on social media, they're talking about the victims of Russian attacks. We've had reports of cluster bombs being used on Mykolaiv in the south, and for most people in Ukraine here, this was something they were expecting, and it's not too much of a shock now that it's actually happening.
Nick Connolly, thank you very much for your reporting on the war in Ukraine.